Okay, everybody, shalom. Thank you for coming. And today, again, Refuah Shlema for NATAH BEN ZEISEL, as well as the liberation of Eretz Yisrael from its enemies, safe return home of the soldiers and the hostages, lasting unity of the people of Israel, and for all of those whose health has been affected by the war, and dedicated to the release of the young man who was sentenced to death in Iran, Arvin Netanel ben Sonia Tziona. Please note that we had previously said Sonia. This is Sonia Tziona is the full name. As well, we are dedicating the shir for the Aliyat Neshamot of Yitzchak Hirsh ben Eliezer. And finally, there's an anonymous contribution for the nitzachon of all of our chayalim, as well as the chatufim to return safe and totally healthy. And all of us pray for Hashem's protection for all of Klal Yisrael and for the Refuah Shlema b'mheira v'yameinu in these days. And once again, in many, many ways, unfortunately, the war has been dragging on for a very, very, very long time. And what happens sometimes is what's called in halacha hesach hadas. We're not always thinking about what's going on because Baruch Hashem, in Hashem's infinite chesed, most of Eretz Yisrael life has been allowed to go relatively normally. This is a tremendous chesed. That's l'mayla min hateva. But the downside of those chasadim is that we stop thinking about those who are suffering, and we have hesach hadas. Our mind is no longer involved in the tzara that Klal Yisrael is facing. So it's very important, b'dafka, when Hashem has been so kind to us in many, many ways, that we do have to focus our tefillas on those who are still struggling, and that Be'ezus Hashem, they should achieve success, hatzlacha, release, geula, and of course that the enemy should not spread its vicious poison further and further. So this week we have Parshas Korach. Parshas Korach, once again, is a fascinating Parsha. One can analyze it in so many ways. One can analyze it Kabbalistically. One can analyze it psychologically. Many different things are going on. Again, just to situate exactly where this is happening or when this is happening, this is actually happening after the Chet, most Rishonim say it happened after the Chet HaMeraglim, but shortly after the Chet HaMeraglim, and many actually say that the impetus why Korach was able to attract a lot of people to go against Moshe is precisely because people are looking at Moshe as a failed leader. Because Moshe's whole job was to take us into Eretz Yisrael. And now God decrees, they're blaming Moshe for their Avera. Now God decrees that we have to wander for 40 years in the desert. So, something's wrong with Moshe. He didn't do the right, he wasn't the right leader, etc. It's interesting, somebody, it's brought down in different Sfarim, a Maisa, that somebody was a Gilgal, somebody was a reincarnation of someone from the Midbar. So he was asked, what was it like during Korach's rebellion? Korach is making all of these arguments. So the person said, it was pretty tough. We honestly didn't know which side to go with. Meaning, in retrospect, we obviously know who was right and who was wrong, but it wasn't such a pashut thing at the particular time. Now, Korach gathers a whole bunch of malcontents with him. Korach gathers Dasan and Aviram, who are always ready to make trouble. Korach gathers many people from Shevet Ruvain, 250 elders. And they present a case to Moshe, which might be called the egalitarian case. Who needs leaders? They were anarchists. Kol ha'eda kulam kedeshim. Everybody is holy. All of us heard the first two commandments. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. Thou shalt not have any other gods. What gives you the right to assert leadership over us? Every Jew is holy. Now, politically, this is exactly what anarchy claims. Anarchy basically says there is no legitimation for any type of leadership over people. Every person makes their own decisions. Of course, I remember around 20 years ago, there was an attempt to hold an anarchist convention in Seattle. But they couldn't get the people together. because who's going to tell them when to show up? So it kind of collapsed in that way. But essentially, Korach is what Rav Soloveitchik called the common sense rebellion. Who needs Gedolim? I can have my opinion about the Torah. You have your opinion. Why is my opinion worse than yours? Why is your opinion better than mine? We believe in God, we believe in Torah, but we interpret what it means. So here's the problem. If Korach's argument is there ought not to be leaders at all, every Yid is holy. Every Yid should interpret what the Torah means to him. Then Moshe Rabbeinu's answer is a non sequitur. Because if you look at Moshe Rabbeinu's answer, Moshe Rabbeinu is addressing Korach, who of course is a Levi. And he says, why are you seeking greater and more honor? Don't you have enough honor? Don't you have enough distinction? God separated you. God raised you from all of the tribes of Israel to serve in the Mishkan and assist the Kohanim. Uvikashtem gam kahuna. And you're not happy with being Leviim. You also want to be the Kohen. Now here's the problem. That wasn't what Korach was saying. Korach wasn't saying, I want to be a Kohen. I'm a better Kohen than Aaron. And then Moshe could say, you have enough honor, you have enough distinction, be happy with what God gave you. Korach is arguing there ought not to be a leadership structure at all. So if my taina is, why have hierarchies? You can't answer it by telling me, oh, you're high enough in the position. That's not my point. My point was not, I'm not high enough. My point was there ought not to be distinctions at all. So l'chaira, Korach is making one claim, and Moshe Rabbeinu is answering a different claim. And the answer is very, very clear, even in Pshuto Shel Mikra, that we're dealing with hidden agendas that Moshe Rabbeinu identified. Korach is arguing egalitarianism, but really what he means is power for me. Like the communists say, equality for everybody. Everybody will be equally miserable. I'll be on top. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu is looking at Korach and saying, you're making this argument that everybody is holy. In reality, it is your jealousy, your ego, your kavod that wants more and more and more and more. And the way you're trying to put yourself in that position is by arguing there ought not to be any type of hierarchy of authority at all. Moshe Rabbeinu saw through this immediately. And one other person saw through it, a person who's not even mentioned by name. And this is the wife of On ben Peles. If you remember, when it lists the revolutionaries who were siding with Korach, 250 elders, etc., it mentions Dasan and Aviram. It mentions, and On ben Peles from Bnei Reuven. He is only mentioned once in the whole Torah, never mentioned again. And in fact, when it describes who died when the ground opened up or when the fire came out of the incense, some people died through the fire, some people died through the ground. I'll get to that a little later. There's no mention of On ben Peles. What happened to him? Where did he go? So the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, On ben Peles was saved by his wife. In fact, it contrasts the difference between the good wife of On ben Peles and the evil wife of Korach, who put gasoline on the fire. On ben Peles comes home after hearing one of Korach's speeches. Every man a king. Every man should be the authority. And she comes in and says, hey, I'm going to be equal to Moshe Rabbeinu. And his wife tells him, as good wives often tell their husbands, you are an idiot. He says, what do you think is going on here? Who do you think is going to win this fight? If Moshe wins, for sure you're in trouble. And even if Korach wins, you think you're going to be anybody? It's just going to replace one boss with another boss. You're going to be a nobody there too. It's interesting. She didn't use from arguments. She didn't use the argument, how can you deny the Torah, etc. She was dealing with this on a very, very practical level. It says, you're worried you're not getting enough kavod in your subordinate status. Don't think it's going to be any better either way. And because of this, she dissuaded him from participating in that rebellion, and his life was saved. As opposed to Korach's wife, when he would discuss what his plans were, she would egg him on. Yeah, you're right, that Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron, the tax system, in fact the Medrash even says, a lot of it was taxation, you're a farmer and you got to take off the truma and the meiser and all of these different things. And she said, you're right, we got to replace this. So the pasuk in Mishlei says, Chachmais Nashim Bonsa Beisa, the wisdom of a good wife builds up a house. Piyavelas, and a perverse wife, Biyadeha Teharsena, with her own hands she destroys it. And the Medrash says, Chachmas Nashim is Ishtai Shalom ben Peles, and the Avelas is Ishto Shel Korach. It's very reminiscent, this idea of hidden agenda. In fact, the hidden agenda really permeated everybody. The Ibn Ezra identifies like 5 different groups, each of which had their own agenda. They're all coming together saying, we want equality, everybody should be equal. In reality, everybody is jockeying for power. The Levium were jealous of the Kohanim. They wanted to be Kohanim. Shevet Ruvain, that originally was the firstborn, was jealous of the Levium taking over from the Bechor. Korach is jealous of either Aaron or Moshe, or maybe both, and the like. So each one is pursuing their own selfish agenda in the guise of a rhetoric of equality, when each one is really only thinking about themselves. This is a famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, every machlokes that is l'shem shamayim, when you have an argument in which they are truly arguing for the sake of God, to understand the truth, to understand the Torah, sofo lehiskayim, eventually both sides are going to endure, meaning we will study both sides, we will learn from both sides, because both protagonists were l'shem shamayim. A machlokes that's not l'shem shamayim eventually gets destroyed. Now the Mishnah then gives an example. What is a machlokes l'shem shamayim? A machlokes like Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. And even though the halacha is always like Beis Hillel, but we continue to study Beis Shammai. Sofo l'skayim. Beis Shammai's shita is studied, we learn from it, we think about it, and of course, and I'll emphasize this later as well, liyasid lava, bimot HaMashiach. The halacha is going to be like Beit Shammai. We'll get to that. But then it says, what's an example of a machlokes that's not l'shem shamayim? Korach va'adaso. Korach and his confederates. Now the Chassam Sofer asks, l'chayra it's not symmetrical, because when you talk about machlokes l'shem shamayim, you give both sides, Hillel, Beis Hillel, versus Beit Shammai. When you're describing machlokes not l'shem shamayim, you only say Korach v'adaso. You don't say the other side. Now maybe a simple answer would be, well, you're not going to say Korach u'Moshe, because that would imply that Moshe was not l'shem shamayim. So you only identify the part of the machlokes that's not l'shem shamayim. That's a simple answer. But the Chassam Sofer gives a different answer. The Chassam Sofer says, when you have a machlokes not l'shem shamayim, even the people on the same side are really arguing with each other. Meaning to say, Korach v'adasai. Even though rhetorically they presented a unified front, in reality each one was pursuing their own aim. Indeed, it's been said many times regarding the state of Israel that one of the things that protects us through Hashgacha Pratis is that the Arabs, hate each other as much, well, maybe not as much, but almost as much as they hate the Jews. So as a result, even when they unify, they're not really unified because each one is pursuing their own selfish end, and as a result, they're less effective than they might otherwise be, because when it's not L'Shem Shamayim, there can't really be Achdus. Everybody is pursuing their own particularized agenda, and therefore Machloka Shelo L'Shem Shamayim, Korach v'Adasa. Korach and all of the groups is a Machlokas. They're all arguing with each other. If you remember really this has kind of been the history of revolutions throughout history. If you go back to the French Revolution, right? So the great rallying call, liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. Let us overthrow the monarchy, Louis the 16th, or whichever Louis it was, I don't remember the number. Let's get rid of the tyrants and establish the universal rights of man. But who did you get replacing Louis? You got Robespierre, people who were murderers, people who were actually much worse than the people they replaced. The communist revolution, communism, overthrow the Tsar. The Tsars were awful, to be sure. We're not friends of the Tsars. But no one's going to tell me that Lenin and Stalin were any type of improvement over the situation of Tsars. So the calls for equality turned out to be totally fake. They were power grabs. They were power grabs. Pol Pot in Cambodia, if you remember him. Pol Pot, mild-mannered elementary school or high school teacher, mathematics teacher, who really wanted to create a society of fairness, equality, where every person had opportunity. And he wound up creating a regime that murdered millions, unbelievable numbers. Even God forbid, even the Holocaust pales in numbers compared to the hashchasa that he did. Mao Zedong in China. All of these revolutions had a common denominator, that rhetorically they were seeking to increase equality, freedom. In reality, they turned into oppression, power grabs. Lahavdil, and I'll say Lahavdil, Korach was proceeding in the same direction. And that is why Moshe Rabbeinu responded in a way that was a non sequitur. Korach is arguing equality. Moshe Rabbeinu argues, why are you pursuing ego gratification here? Accept the gift that God has given you. Some of you might be familiar with a book written by George Orwell, the author of 1984, which is the more famous book, but this is a book, Animal Farm. And Animal Farm is a parody of the Russian Revolution of 1917. And he describes a farm of kind of intelligent animals that are communicating with each other, and they're not being treated very well. So the animals rebel and overthrow the human masters. And one of the animals becomes kind of a leader. It was a pig named Napoleon, that's the name of the person. And Napoleon keeps on talking about equality and fairness, and we have to treat everybody with dignity. And it turns out that Napoleon becomes a dictator that was much worse than the human dictator that was overthrown. This was Orwell's take on the Russian Revolution. And in truth, most revolutions were this way. Again, the American Revolution might be an interesting exception, although some people are even debating that. Okay. But the fact that there are exceptions does not detract from the fundamental general pattern that you see in history. So this is the notion of the hidden agenda. Now, Kabbalistically, there's some deep things going on here. And that is, the Zohar understands that, again, exactly who does Korach want to be? Does he want to be Moshe? Does he want to be Aaron? It's not clear really who he wants. Moshe himself says, Ubikashtem gam kahuna, you're looking to be Kohen. That in fact, Korach wanted to be Kohen Gadol. Korach wanted to be a Kohen Gadol, and he wanted Shevet Levi to be the Kohanim. Now, there weren't that many Kohanim then, right? You just had Aaron, two of his surviving sons, Eliezer and Isamar, and Pinchas, who was not yet consecrated as a Kohen. All there were four Kohanim at the time, but Korach wanted the Levium to take over. And Kabbalistically, the argument is the following. Kohanim represent the midah of chesed, chasodim, the midah of chesed. Levium represent the midah of gevura. Thus we find by the Chedo Egel, Aaron the Kohen was conciliatory, and he tried to accommodate people, even though it turned out not to be the right decision necessarily. The Levium were the zealots who stood up. So in Kabbalah, the Zohar says, Kohanim are chasadim, Levium are gevurais. The reason why the kahuna was given to Kohanim is based on the idea that God's original plan, Bereshis bara Elokim. Elokim is midas hadin. God's original plan was to create the world with midas hadin. Meaning, you do good, God rewards you, you do bad, you get zapped with lightning. Ra'ah, Hashem saw that the world could not survive on strict din. So he moderated the din with an infusion of rachamim and chesed. That's why initially the Torah says, Bereshis, in the beginning, bara Elokim. Later it says, Biyom asos Hashem Elokim. Eretz v'shamayim. Hashem is Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is the midah of rachamim. That the world should have been based on din, but God had to deviate from his ideal plan to be mishtatef, to combine rachamim and din. Which means in many, many ways, this is not an ideal world. Din is actually the ideal. Rachamim is a compromise due to the inevitable imperfection of the human personality. In fact, the Shalach HaKadosh says a very fascinating thought. If you remember when Rabbi Akiva was being tortured to death because he was teaching Torah and the Romans had him arrested and tortured, and he died from that torture. So as he was dying, as his flesh was being combed with iron combs, the Malachi Hashares in Shema. Well, two things. The Talmidim said to him, "Is this the reward for your Torah learning?" And Rabbi Akiva said, as he was dying, all of his life he wanted to fulfill the verse of loving Hashem, b'chol levavcha, with all your heart, b'chol nafshecha, with all of your soul. And now he is given a chance to give his soul to God. He says to his Talmidim, do you want to take away that opportunity from me? That's the discussion between Rabbi Akiva and his Talmidim. But the Medrash says there was a discussion between the heavenly angels and the Almighty, where the heavenly angels said to Hashem, Zu Torah v'zu sechara. This is Torah and this is the reward for Torah. The person who gave his life to teach Torah and to learn Torah, this is his reward. And Hashem said, enigmatically, Shisok, be silent. Kach Allah b'machshava lefanai. This is my machshava. Don't question my thoughts. So the simple meaning is God simply saying, don't ask questions. The Shalach HaKadosh adds a very fascinating little diuk here. He says that God isn't simply saying, don't ask me questions. God is actually answering the question. My machshava, my original intention in creation, was strict din. It's only the compromise to human imperfection that I moderated the din with rachamim. But that compromise only applies to regular people. The tzaddikim are still judged by the olam hamachshava, by the world of God's divine thoughts. And in strict din, even Rabbi Akiva is not going to be immune. So that's the dia. Kach ola b'machshava. That's the deeper explanation, the Shalah says, of the famous teaching of Chazal, that tzaddikim are governed by a higher standard. Now you're going to have two people. A regular person who does a certain thing, which God may give him a pass, and a tzaddik does the same thing, and it's much, much, much worse, because a tzaddik is judged by the standard of divine machshava. As opposed to most of us, we are judged by the moderation of that machshava, by the midas hadin. Now, it's brought down in the name of the Arizal that this is why the halacha is like Beis Hillel over Beis Shammai. As it's well known, although it's not 100% an accurate description, but it's a 99% pretty accurate description, that when there's a machlokas Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, almost invariably, Beis Hillel represents the more lenient position, and Beis Shammai represents the stricter position. This is well known, just looking at the different machlokim. The Arizal writes, that is because the shayrish of Beis Shammai is rooted in the midas hadin, and therefore he will see halacha through that prism of midas hadin. The shayrish of Beis Hillel's neshama is rooted in the midah of rachamim and chesed, so he will see halacha through that prism. I need to emphasize, as a matter of halachic process, these are not self-conscious types of thought processes. It's not that Beis Hillel got up every morning and figured out, how can I make life easier for people? And it's not that Beis Shammai got up every morning and says, I want to be mean today, who can I hurt today? By being machmer. That's not how it works. We have to believe that these great people were looking for truth. They were looking for emes. However, the way you perceive emes is affected by the root of your neshama. These are spiritual connections. If the neshama is rooted in chesed, you will perceive emes a certain way. If your neshama is rooted in din, you will perceive emes in a different way. So the Arizal says the shayrish of Beis Hillel is in midas hachesed or rachamim. The shayrish of Beis Shammai is in midas hadin. The reason why in olam hazeh the halacha is like Beis Hillel is because in this world rachamim becomes the dominant aspect. So says the Arizal, when Mashiach comes and the world reaches a perfected state, an elevated state, Hashem will be able to go back to his original plan. The original plan was midat hadin. And in that original plan, the halacha is going to be like Beis Shammai. And therefore this is the source of the famous statement you probably have heard before, that liyasid lavav, because liyasid lavav is a little ambiguous, it doesn't mean necessarily as soon as Mashiach comes, but at some point in the Messianic era, there's going to be a major, major change, halacha k'Beis Shammai, because the world will transition to a hanhaga of din, because Hashem's original perfect machshava will be able to be implemented and carried out. So, therefore, the Arizal writes, actually it's based on the Zohar, but he's explaining passages in the Zohar, that liyasid lavai, the Leviim will become the Kohanim. Meaning, essentially Kohanim, who are also Leviim, will simply be assimilated into Leviim, and Leviim will be Kohanim. Because once again, Kohanim as a separate group represents Chasadim, Leviim represents Midas Hadin. In this world, the din is secondary to the Rachamim, so Kohanim do the main job. Liyasid Lavai, the Leviim will become Kohanim. Who will become the Leviim? That's an interesting question, but at least the Leviim will become Kohanim. And the Zohar goes further. Korach will be the Kohen Gadol. Korach will be the Kohen Gadol. So, according to the Zohar is masber. It's a complicated arichas. I'm just touching the surface here. That Korach's mistake was he was jumping the gun. He was anticipating a future that wasn't there yet. Korach sees the miracles of the desert. He sees the man. He sees the traveling well of Miriam. He sees the clouds of glory. He remembers the miracles of the Exodus, the splitting of the Red Sea, and Maimed Har Sinai. Korach feels this is the Zman of Geula. This is Yemot Mashiach. Now, it's a little difficult for me. How could he feel that way after the Meraglim? I understand before the Chet Meraglim that we were going straight to Eretz Yisrael. That's maybe an easier mistake to make, and it might not even have been a mistake. After the Meraglim, it's a little more difficult to justify why he saw it that way. But he looked at this as the Messianic era. And therefore, the Zohar says, his taina was, I'm entitled to be Kohen, because Leviim are becoming Kohanim. His mistake was, we still live in an imperfect world, particularly after the Chet Meraglim, and after the Chet Egel, for that matter, too. We're no longer in Gan Eden. We've been expelled from Gan Eden, and therefore we still need the Chasadim to be more powerful over the Gevurot, over the powers of Din. Therefore, Aaron is still Kohen, and you guys are Leviim, and don't complain. So this is a kind of a long mystical interpretation. So the first thought I shared with you is more of a psychological idea of hidden agendas. People who call for equality often just mean their own power grab. That's kind of maybe a Pashut Pshat. On a deeper level, Korach was perceiving the Dor HaMidbar as living in the Messianic age, in which we can go back to God's original plan of Midat Hadin, and Leviim represent the Koach of Din, and they could overpower the Gevurot. These are called sweetened Gevurah, meaning the Gevurot are now sweetened, and they can take over, and that's why the halacha is going to be like Beit Shammai when Mashiach comes, because that was God's original plan, and his mistake was he jumped the gun. So it's interesting that Korach jumps the gun at both ends of the equation. He's jumping the gun by looking into a future that's not yet here yet. Right? He's looking ahead, and he's trying to project that future back into the present. But it's fascinating that the Medrash says he also made a mistake of looking into a more of a short-term future. Meaning, you see another problem of projecting backwards, and that is, if you read Sefer Tehillim, there are 11 chapters of Tehillim that are assigned to the Bnei Korach. One of the Shir Shel Yom is Shir Mizmor Bnei Korach, and the capital of Tehillim that we say before Tekiyas Shofar 7 times. Lam Natseach, Livnei Korach Mizmor. There's a total of 11. Now, there is a machlokas what that means when it says to the conductor, to the sons of Korach. Are we saying they wrote the Tehillim, or they were assigned to sing the Tehillim? Meaning that the machlokas meforshim, if the statement Shir Mizmor Livnei Korach or Lam Natseach Livnei Korach, is that referring to authorship or assignment? But the one thing we know for sure from Divrei Hayamim is that the main singers in the Beis Hamikdash, the Leviim who sang, were the descendants, Bnei doesn't mean sons, descendants of Korach. And that Korach is, the famous Korach. How were they around? So remember, the Torah says in Parshas Pinchas that although when the ground opened up, it swallowed Korach and his sons, but it mentions Bnei Korach lo mesu. The children of Korach, the sons of Korach, actually didn't die. They didn't die. And Rashi brings the Medrash that basically they did fall into the ground, but in that moment they did sincere tshuva, and God gave them something to hold on to, a ledge, and they were able to climb out. The power of tshuva. And their descendants were the great Levium who sang songs of praise in the Beis HaMikdash, the Bnei Korach. Not only that, but the Navi Shmuel, who is a Levi, and Shmuel is considered to be equal in greatness to Moshe and Aaron combined, was a descendant of Korach. So the Gemara actually says, the Medrash actually says, that part of Korach's arrogance was he was looking with Ruach HaKodesh and he saw that Shmuel would come from him, who's greater than Moshe and Aaron on some level. And the Levium who will sing in the Beis HaMikdash come from him. So he figured, hey, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. He says, I got such great descendants. Got to be based on me. So you see that these are two examples of looking into the future. The short-term future of seeing Shmuel Hanavi and the Levium, and the long-term future of Yemot HaMashiach, where Korach himself will have the role of Kohen Gadol, and Shevet Levi will take over Kahuna. And this led him astray. Things have to come in their right time. That's part of the lesson here. Besides the hidden agenda, we got to understand there's a time for things. You try to rush things, they can be very, very disastrous. Indeed, the Gemara uses this very lashon about Mashiach. Lo yitchaku es haketz. Do not try to push the end of days. So you bring Mashiach by mitzvos, by Torah learning, for sure. But whatever mystical ways there are to bring Mashiach early, you got to be careful, because things have to come based on Hashem's timing. So it's a funny situation. On one hand, God will respond to our overtures, even if it's not always good for us, if that's what we want. The way a person wants to go, God will take him. But we have to be careful what we ask for, because as the saying goes, you might get it. And when you get it, it may not be what you need, and it may not be what's good for you. So it's a little tricky in that way. And based on the Zohar and the Ari, the story of Korach is an example of trying to bring in a future situation that the world was not yet ready for, and that is that Korach, the Midas Hadin, would take over in the world. Yeah.
Criticizing the Jewish people, say, what are you waiting for? Why are you building?
Yeah, that's regarding the building of the second temple. Yeah, it's very true that after the 70 years of the Babylonian exile, when the Jews were under Persian rule, and they had started building the temple under Cyrus, under Koresh, and then Cyrus had issued an interdiction, a ban, for 18 years, and there was no initiative on the part of the Jews to rescind that ban. So we do find that the Navi, Chagai and Zechariah, those two Nevi'im, both of them, were very, very critical of why don't the Jewish people take initiative to build a temple. I know it is a good point, but part of it might also be they weren't praying to Hashem about it. They didn't care, meaning the Navi wasn't necessarily talking about taking a physical initiative until God gave a green light, but he's saying you should have cared. Why didn't you demonstrate that this was important to you? Now, in terms of green light, the Navi is giving him a green light right then. He's saying now is the time, but he's giving them the signal. Okay, now I want to mention a third aspect. So I mentioned the hidden agenda aspect. We mentioned the idea of anticipating the future before it's here. There is a third point, also from the Arizal, that the Shem Mishmuel brings. He brings a fascinating gematria, but doesn't fully... Well, the Shem Mishmuel, the Ari brings the gematria, the Shem Mishmuel explains the gematria. The Arizal's gematria is very enigmatic. He points out that the gematria of Korach is 308. Kuf Reish Ches. The gematria of Moshe is 345. Okay? The difference between 345 and 308 is 37. 37 is the gematria of Hevel, vanity, Hevel. Therefore, if you take those three gematrias and you work with them, we can make the following equations. Korach plus Hevel equals Moshe, or Moshe minus Hevel equals Korach. Ad Kan is the Arizal. Right? He's linking three gematrias. The gematria of Moshe, the gematria of Korach, the gematria of Hevel. What's going on? So the Shem Shmuel was a great Hasidic Rebbe. He was the son of the Avnei Nezer, who was the son-in-law of the Kutzker Rebbe. So the Shem Shmuel was actually a grandson of the Kutzker Rebbe, and his father, the Avnei Nezer, Rav Avram Bornstein, the Sachatchever Rebbe, was one of the great Gedolei Hador in Europe, recognized as such, even among non-Hasidim. He was one of the Posky Hador, as well as being a great Hasidic Rebbe. Says the following explanation. Let's go back. Well, actually, it's the second crime of humanity, but the first crime of humanity is the Chet of the Eitz Hadas. But the second crime is the murder. Cain murders Hevel. Murder out of jealousy, out of anger, out of rage, however you describe that initial murder. And let's look at the names of Cain and Hevel. Chava has a son. Are they twins or not twins? But whatever it is, Cain is the firstborn, even if it's the first of the twins. So she calls him Cain because she says, Konisi ish es Hashem. Konisi. Konisi means I have created a person, a man, with God. I have created a human being with God. She kind of negates her husband's contribution there, but she says, it's me and God, we created this human being. And then she has a second son, whether it's a twin or not, that's a machlokas, and she calls him Hevel. Now there's no reason that's given in the Torah for why he's called Hevel. Now why? We're given a reason why Cain was called Cain. We're not given a reason why Hevel is called Hevel. But we know the translation of Hevel. Hevel is vapor. Hevel is breath. Hevel is like mere air. Right? In Koheles, Shlomo HaMelech says over and over again, Havel Havolim, Amar Koheles. Vanity of vanity, which really means emptiness of emptiness. Hakol Hevel. Right? He's looking at the world and sees how many things in the world are just not worth it. So, it's a strange thing to name your child. You name your child Hevel, nothingness, futility. It's almost as if maybe she had a prophetic intimation that he would be killed. Perhaps that might be shaykh. But the Shem Shmuel wants to say the following. This reflects two aspects of a human being. And in effect, Cain and Hevel are two halves of a Shleimus Ha'adam. Cain, I have created man, represents the aspect of a human being that needs to be creative, needs to dominate, needs to master nature, needs to control Teva. Konisi, I'm not just this helpless thing, but I'm made in the image of God because I am supposed to create. I am supposed to dominate. I am supposed to control. God did not want us to be just passive. He wants us to drain the swamps, build the cities, create economic systems and political systems. That we are supposed to be partners with God. Konisi es Hashem is partnership. Be a partner with Hashem in making this world. This is very important. Emunah in Judaism is not passive or quiescent. Emunah doesn't mean I sit back as poor people are suffering and say, God will take care of them. I got to take responsibility. I got to create justice. I got to try to create healing. I got to try to make the world a better place. You see, Emunah, if taken to an extreme, could be a very passive idea. A person might basically say, God runs the world, I really have no responsibilities. But that would be derelict. The whole Torah is predicated on human responsibility. Even though the Reform took over this phrase, but I will use it because it's in Chazal, Tikkun Olam, to make the world a better place, a holier place, a place of goodness, a place of blessing even in the material sense, to the extent that we're able to do that. So Cain represents the aspect of human personality that is creative, that initiates, that takes charge. And this was reflected in Cain as a person. Cain was actually a much greater innovator than Hevel. If we ask, who was the first person, at least in the Pasuk, who invented the idea of a korban in Avodat Hashem? It was Cain. Hevel improved on Cain's idea by the choicest. But who was the one who thought of the idea of korban? Cain was the mechadesh. Cain was the innovator. Hevel simply reacted to what Cain did and tried to make it a better thing.
Didn't Adam instigate the
Yeah, there is. There are midrashim that say Adam brat. That is correct. That's what I'm saying. But according to the Psukim, Cain is the first one that it's mentioned. In fact, according to other midrashim, Cain taught Adam Harishon the idea of tshuva later, after Cain killed Hevel. Cain kind of invented tshuva. And he told Adam Harishon, who said, I didn't know there was such a thing. So Cain, with all of his flaws, was the great innovator in life. Hevel kind of represents the notion of a human being recognizing that I'm really nothing. Without God, I am just the Hevel. So if you think about this, each personality type has a Maila and a Chisaron. The Cains of the world build the cities. They discover cures for cancer. They create, hopefully good court systems and science and technology. And even in Torah learning, they're the ones that are machadesh. They build yeshivos. And they write svarim because they understand the power of their intellect and the power of their creativity. But the character flaw, of course, is the potential for arrogance, for gaiva, kochi v'yotzem yadi, that it is my power and my might that accomplishes everything. So the danger of the Cain is arrogance. The Hevels of the world are a personality type that are exactly the opposite. Hevel recognizes their subservience, their inferiority, their helplessness. They understand without God they're nothing. And that's beautiful. They have humility. They submit to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They know Ein Od Milvado, there is nothing besides God in the world. But the downside of that is a passivity and a helplessness in which you don't take the initiative in life, in both Gashmias and in Ruchnias. Right? If you're a Hevel, in fact, it reminds me of something. It's an old Hasidic story where they say a certain Chassid said, I didn't want to learn Gemara. Why don't I learn Gemara? Because Gemara is full of questions. You're asking questions. He says, a Yid shouldn't ask questions. What are you asking questions? How could the Mishnah say this? How could the Torah say this? If that's what God said, don't ask questions. He was basically saying there's no purpose of learning a Torah at all because you're asking questions on God. Right? If you see, that's reductio ad absurdum. I'm such a maimin, I don't ask any questions about Torah. And yet, our whole learning is question, probe, understand. So, Cain represents creativity, autonomy, initiative. Hevel represents faith, humility, submission. But on the negative side, the Cains are prone to arrogance, and the Hevels are prone to helplessness, despondency, and passivity. Ideally, the human personality needs to be a fusion of the Cain and the Hevel. I'm going to insert a little bibliographical footnote here. For those of you that are familiar with Rav Soloveitchik's writings, if any of you have ever read The Lonely Man of Faith, a very, very famous essay, these two aspects of the human personality are based on his writing, but he projected it much earlier. He talked about the two accounts of the creation of Adam Harishon, and he called it Adam 1 and Adam 2, and he called Adam 1 majestic man, and he called Adam 2 redemptive man. I'm modifying this a little bit by applying this, based on the Shem Shmuel, applying this to Cain v'Hevel. Cain would correspond to what Rav Soloveitchik called Adam 1, and Hevel would correspond to what Rav Soloveitchik called Adam 2. So if you're familiar with the Lonely Man of Faith, you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, it does not affect this Devar Torah in that way. So, we know, of course, that the Arizal developed the idea of Gilgal. That when a neshama does not complete its rectification, it comes back to try to finish the task. Cain left the world in a state of arrogance. Hevel left the world in a state of passivity. Cain and Hevel needed to come back. Says Rav Chaim Vital in the Shara Gilgulim, Cain was reincarnated in the persona of Korach. Hevel was reincarnated in the persona of Moshe Rabbeinu. So Korach is a Gilgal of Cain. Moshe is a Gilgal of Hevel. And it's so interesting how the outcome of the story is literally a reversal. First time around, Cain kills Hevel. Second time around, Hevel, Moshe, causes the death of Cain. Things got rectified in that mechanical way. But spiritually as well, Hevel had a tikkun through the life of Moshe. How is that so? Moshe Rabbeinu is described in the Torah as Anav Mikol Adam, the most humble of all people. That's Hevel. And yet, Moshe Rabbeinu was the leader of 3 million people. He made the decisions that had to be made. He broke the luchos when they had to be broken. He prayed for Klal Yisrael. He interceded. Moshe Rabbeinu, in spite of that midah of Hevel, understood that when you nullify yourself before God, that's not an excuse for passivity and inaction. It's the other way around. That energizes you to take the initiative to bring Kedusha into the world. So Moshe Rabbeinu took the reincarnation of Hevel's neshama, and he was mitaken what it was that Hevel lacked. Korach, unfortunately, incorporated the arrogance of Cain, and his avoda was to be subservient to Moshe and learn the lesson of humility. But unfortunately, the Cain in him stayed as it was, and he died without that tikkun. Although the first Zohar I mentioned gives him there would be Kohen Gadol in the future, indicates Korach will have a tikkun, but in this Parsha there's no tikkun. In this Parsha. So now the Shem Shmuel says the gematrias that the Arizal mentioned are so beautiful and exact. Korach plus Hevel equals Moshe, meaning, or Moshe minus Hevel equals Korach. Korach and Moshe, in terms of their talents, in terms of their abilities, are equal. They both had tremendous capacity for leadership. They both had tremendous capacity for nevuah. Remember, Korach is getting all these nevuahs about the future. So, what differentiates the Korach personality from the Moshe personality? Korach didn't have hevel, humility. Moshe had hevel. Meaning, if you took Korach and you added hevel, you'd get Moshe. If you took Moshe and you took away the hevel, you'll get Korach. Mamish, beautiful gematria. That this was the fatal flaw. And in that sense, similar to Bilam, which we'll talk about, it's a very similar paradigm. Korach is an example of a tragic figure in the Greek sense of tragedy. In the famous definition of Aristotle that we talk about, a Greek tragedy, where you're destroyed from within. Meaning, if a person's in a building, God forbid, and the building collapses, that is very, very sad. We mourn and we grieve. But in the Greek sense of tragedy, that's not a tragedy, that's a very, very sad and unfortunate occurrence. Tragedy is when a person has greatness, but they're destroyed not because a building falls on them. They're destroyed because of a flaw in their personality that destroys, like a worm, like a parasite, like a cancer. It destroys the goodness that was in them. That's a tragedy. That's why Elisha ben Avuya is a truly tragic, right? Rabbi Akiva is not a tragic figure. See, this is it. You see it actually from Chazal itself. Rabbi Akiva died a horrible death. And we grieve over Rabbi Akiva and his Talmidim. But we would not apply the word tragedy. We wouldn't call Rabbi Akiva a tragic figure. Who would we call a tragic figure? Elisha ben Avuya we would call a tragic figure. Elisha ben Avuya was an enormously great Torah scholar. Enormously great. But he was destroyed from within. That's a tragedy. Korach was as great as Moshe. That's what it's saying. But lacking the hevel, the Gaiva destroyed him. The Gaiva destroyed him. We're going to see Bilam is a very similar paradigm that way. And this is the meaning of this particular gematria, that Korach, when you add in the hevel, you will get Moshe. Moshe, if you subtract the hevel, you will get Korach. And it's something we have to remember. Fortunately, even in this day and age, we see it in the political world for sure. But unfortunately, we have a number of sad occasions. We've seen it in the Torah world. Again, I'm not going to get into any detail, but sometimes there are people who are very, very learned and very, very, I don't mean mamish gedolim, but people who were very well established and very capable teachers who had large followings. And there was a gaiva, or a sense that I don't have to keep the rules that everyone else has to keep. I'm kind of above that. And unfortunately, not only did it hurt many, many people, but it also destroyed them. I know people sometimes say, well, why do you have Rahmanas for? Well, the truth is, when, maybe it's rabbinical fellowship, I don't know, but the truth is, when a rabbi gets destroyed from within, it is a tragedy, because there was a potential for goodness, a potential to reach people, a potential to do good in the world. And that's been totally destroyed. And gaiva is often that mechanism that triggers follow-up things like sexual abuse or whatever it is, but they often emerge initially from a certain sense of gaiva that I don't have to follow even the halachas that other people have to follow. Really, this was the mistake of Shlomo HaMelech. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says why the Torah does not like to give reasons for mitzvahs. So it says, because when the Torah gives a reason, people will start debating whether it applies to them. The king is not allowed to have a lot of horses, lest he return the nation to Mitzrayim. Shlomo HaMelech says, that's not going to apply to me. I'll have horses. I won't return people to Mitzrayim. Of course, what happens is, he does. A king cannot have a lot of wives, lest he become distracted. Well, that doesn't apply to me. I'm the wisest of all people. And he had his 1,000 wives, and what happened is what happened. So Hashem basically said, I'm not going to give you reasons for stuff. Once I start giving you reasons, you start debating whether it applies to you or it doesn't apply to you. So it's the same thing. It all comes from the gaiva that I'm better than everybody else, and therefore the rules that apply to everybody don't apply to me. And that is what creates the Korachs of the world, who are great, great people who have greatness. But they are destroyed from the flaw that is within. So anyway, have a good Shabbos, and thank you for coming.